Welcome back to my series on Paul's first letter to Timothy. Last time we did the first half of chapter 2, which was dense with topics, but overall the message was that Paul wanted the community, when it came together, to pray for their civic leaders. Today we'll be doing the back half of the chapter, and I dare say it is the most controversial passage in the whole New Testament. So let's dive in. Verse 8. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise also, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold, or pearls, or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. Let's pause. Okay, so again, Paul is imagining the community gathering together for prayer and worship. I think the principles he's laying out here can apply outside that context, but I believe that's what he has in mind. He begins by saying the men should be raising their hands up for prayer and not for fighting. So you have here calling out a characteristically male bad behavior, fist fighting, and telling them to swap it out for the Christian one, namely prayer. Then he turns to the lady folk. Now what's important here, I think, isn't necessarily the specifics, but the overall ethic of what he's going for. A characteristic behavior among women is to dress in a way that attracts attention and to try to one-up one another in fabulousness. So Paul lists out some of the ways that gets done and says, none of that. Instead, he says if a woman wants to adorn herself, she should do so with virtue and good works. Fair enough. Now for the fun part. Verse 11. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue with faith and love and holiness with self-control. All right, if you remember back in 1 Corinthians 14, there was a passage where Paul says that women should learn in silence at Christian gatherings. I noted how some folks theorized that Paul didn't really mean that, but the theory stinks because Paul reiterates that teaching here in his letter to Timothy. And here it is. Paul says he wants women to learn quietly and with submissiveness. He elaborates upon that in the next sentence. He does not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Now the first question one should ask is, in what context? Does Paul mean that no woman should relay information to any man at any time under any context? So if a man asks a woman for directions, she should politely decline and have her husband do it? That would be absurd. Or maybe Paul is saying that a woman shouldn't relay information on theology or religion to a man. Well, that cannot be the case either because we have at least one example of a woman instructing a man in matters of theology. That's when Priscilla and Aquila invited Apollos into their home to instruct him on Christian baptism. But that aside, we also know that women can receive the gift of prophecy. We see that all the way back in the Old Testament with Deborah, but we also see it in the New Testament with the prophetess Anna, and Paul recognizes that women can receive the gift of prophecy in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. What we don't have is an example of a woman instructing the assembled church as an authoritative teacher. And that, I'd say, is what Paul has in mind. He's saying that there can be no women who teach with authority in the Christian church. In the Catholic world, there are many teachers, instructors, professors, and catechists. I'm one of them. But the only authoritative teachers of the church are those who have received ordination through holy orders. So for us, the upshot of this teaching is that women cannot be ordained. Every sacrament has certain matter that must be present for it to be valid. Baptism requires water, the Eucharist requires bread and wine, confession requires an ordained priest and a penitent sinner, marriage requires a man and a woman, anointing of the sick requires a person with compromised health, and holy orders requires a man. Thus, it's not that the church refuses to ordain women, it literally cannot do it. All the appropriate rituals could be done and all the right words said over a woman, and she would depart a layperson still, only now a layperson who has participated in sacrilege. This teaching has been settled for a long time before the modern era, but sometimes things need to be reiterated. So it was settled yet again by St. John Paul II back in 1994 in a document called Ordinatio Sacerdotales, where he closed the document by saying, Wherefore, in order that all doubt may be removed regarding a matter of great importance, a matter which pertains to the Church's divine constitution itself, in virtue of my ministry of confirming the brethren, I declare that the church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women, and that this judgment is to be definitively held by all the church's faithful. Now, the next question one might ask is, what's the motivation here? Why would Paul say this? Moreover, why would God make the sacrament unavailable to women? Well, Paul follows up by explaining. He begins with the word for, so that means what follows is his explanation. In this case, it's a two-part explanation. Here we go. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Why is Paul pointing that out? What did he mean? Well, back in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 9, Paul says, "Neither was man created for the woman, but the woman for the man." The way Paul sees it, the creation of Adam first, and then Eve as a helper, gives him a sort of preeminence, a primordial form of leadership, which is meant to be the pattern for the human race. And this is borne out by human experience. There have been a couple studies, one done by the Swiss government and another one by the Promise Keepers Ministry, which both found that a father has outsized influence on the religious upbringing of his kids. Of course, you have to point out that those studies all produce averages and bell curves, which mean that there will be outliers and individuals with contrary experiences, but the point remains. Men tend to set the spiritual tenor for a household, and the church is the household of God. Okay, now we move on to the second part of Paul's explanation. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. This part will strike people as completely wild for a couple reasons. First, why does Paul call out Eve in this way? Weren't they both deceived? I find this to be a very fascinating explanation of what happened back in Genesis chapter 3, and the answer is that Adam and Eve both failed, but in different ways. Eve's failure mode is that she really was deceived by the serpent. She listened to him, came to believe him, desired the things he promised, and then ate the fruit, and immediately turned to suggest the same for her husband. Adam failed in a different way. First, he shouldn't have allowed Eve to talk to the serpent, and then when Eve offered him the fruit, he wasn't deceived. He knew it was wrong and did it anyway, to keep peace with his wife. He was supposed to be the leader of the human race, and he chose to disobey God, which is why we refer to the fall of mankind as the fall of Adam. Alright, so you may say, what does this have to do with women today? Well, the best answer, one which is rejected by many commentators today, but was in fact the one given to us by St. John Chrysostom, is that Paul is saying the deception of Eve is paradigmatic of the female sex down to today. Again, this strikes modern audiences as completely crazy and unfair. But is it? I like to explain by asking the following question. What things are women better at compared to men? What's funny is that in our society, this is a perfectly acceptable question, and people won't bat an eye at answering it. If you look online, you'll find articles and studies claiming that women make better managers, investors, legislators, and plenty of other stuff compared to men. And if you look up vocations where men are better, the search result will find more areas where women are claimed to be superior, which is hilarious. As for their reasoning, these articles will say that women have been proven to possess greater empathy than men, and that's true, it's scientifically proven. All told, women have greater strengths when it comes to listening, empathizing, collaborating, and compromising. These skills are often argued to make women better at certain professions. However, where it gets controversial is when you point out that these strengths are not without their drawbacks. While these strengths may serve to avoid conflict and seeking goals as a community through compromise, they do not serve if the goal is to maintain unchangeable dogmas in the face of people who find them offensive, even hurtful. I think back to an interview that Pope Francis did, and he was presented with a sob story about a girl who has her heart set on being ordained, and the woman asks, can she ever have her dreams fulfilled? And the late Pope just answered with a curt, no. Similarly, imagine if you have the arch-heretic Arius on your hands, and he's spreading the lie that Jesus wasn't fully, eternally consubstantial with the Father. Do you want him to be confronted by a clergy who are gifted in de-escalation, empathy, and compromise? Not really, no. Humanly speaking, it would be impossible to maintain orthodoxy. And you can see that in the modern world. If you look at the mainline Protestant churches in America, they have all ordained female clergy, and not a single one of them has been able to resist the onslaught of our culture, which demands acceptance for sodomy as a valid form of marriage. When women are put in the doctrinal driver's seat, the ability to say no and offend the culture is sapped away. Okay, now let's proceed to the final point. Paul says, yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Now, if one were to approach this from a non-Catholic point of view, this passage would be incomprehensible. In those communities, the word saved is used exclusively to refer to moving from a state of enmity with God to friendship with God. And the idea that women would enter into friendship with God by bearing children is irreconcilable with the notion of being saved by grace through faith. It would also invite troubling questions about the eternal fate of women who never marry or never have children. But this passage is easier for Catholics. First, as Catholics, we don't use the word saved exclusively to refer to entering into a state of grace. We recognize that the Bible also uses the term salvation and saved to refer to a present tense and ongoing process. For instance, in Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, it says, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." In other words, we can view salvation more broadly as a whole process of God conforming you to the image of pure love. Your journey of becoming more holy, also called sanctification, can be understood as an ongoing process of being saved, and it is in that sense that Paul uses it here. The second thing to point out is the word translated as childbearing can refer to the act of giving birth, but can also be understood more broadly to the task of raising children. So you can put those two concepts together to get Paul's meaning here. He's saying that motherhood is a source of sanctification for women, whereas men have a vocation which is unique to them in the form of ordained leadership in the church. Women also have a vocation which is unique to them, maternity, and it is a source of sanctification for all women who do it with virtue. And with that, we reach the end of 1 Timothy chapter 2. See you next time.